Welcome back to Teacher Talks. I'm Maria Keffler.
And I'm Erin Brewer. And today we're going to talk about something called autogynophilia, which is a really unusual word. And a lot of people may not have ever heard of it before.
It may be something that you've considered cross-dressing or transsexualism, but autogynophilia is a disorder where a man experiences sexual arousal by presenting himself as a woman, by dressing as a woman, by going into women's spaces. He gets aroused by that.
And a lot of times, men with autogynophilia are kind of mocked and teased because their disorder is socially unacceptable. We don't like to talk about sexual perversions and fetishes, and paraphilias is what the technical term is. However, in this case, I think it's important to note that boys and men who have autogynophilia have a disorder, and that even though that disorder can mean that what they're doing is distasteful to many of us and even offensive to many of us, because they want to go into women's locker rooms, they want to go into women's bathrooms, sometimes they will go in there and masturbate, something that many of us find very distasteful. And yet these are boys and men who are struggling with a mental health issue, and I believe deserve compassion and kindness and understanding. If we can understand that many of these males have struggled with this, that they're embarrassed by it, they know that this is not socially acceptable. And I've even talked to an autogynephile who was kind of mortified because he respected women and he didn't want to come across as a pervert, and yet this was his disorder that he was struggling with. And I don't think that we're going to be able to really help autogynephiles to recover from their disorder unless we extend kindness and compassion to them, and recognize that this is a mental health issue as much as gender dysphoria is a mental health issue. It's just a different type of mental health issue.
I think a lot of times when we're talking about transgender rights and we're talking about some of these policies and things that we're pushing back on, autogynephiles get blamed for a lot of this, that, oh, this is all on autogynephiles driving this because they want to normalize this. I think there's a small percentage of autogynephiles who are doing that, who are trying to co-opt children and schools and the culture to normalize transgender ideology so that it justifies them doing what they want to do. I don't think that's the entire body of autogynephiles. I think that's a small group. And I agree with you. We need to have compassion on people who deal with this as the mental disorder that it is. I've seen a couple of the interviews that you've done with people who struggle, men who struggle with autogynephilia, and some of them are really mortified. Some of them are really unhappy with what's happening with gendered ideology, the way it's being pushed into the culture and forced upon children. And we really need to recognize that this is not all men. This is not all men have a sexual perversion, all gynephiles are pedophiles. Not at all. That is not the case.
And I think it's important to recognize that autogynephilia can be rooted in trauma and sexual assault and other kinds of difficulties that a child had. And so this is just another way in which that trauma is being exhibited or coped with. It's kind of a coping mechanism. And oftentimes these are men who are deeply unhappy. They're trying to find a way to exist in the world, and um, they're not being given the boundaries that they need. So as we continue to embrace this ideology and say things like trans women are women, we are actually, instead of providing an important boundary to these men and saying, no, you can, maybe you can dress up as a woman in your own bedroom, but that's where it stops. Now we're saying, bring it out here into the public, and we're not providing them with important boundaries that protect them as well, because this is, again, a, a disordered kind of thought process. It's not a healthy thought process. It's not embracing a healthy sexuality. And rather than providing some very important guidelines, we're actually encouraging this paraphilia, and that's not good for society, but it's not also not good for the autogynephile who needs some ways to, restrict that behavior.
Mhm. I want to reiterate what you said, that this is a sexual perversion. It's a sexual problem. I would go so far as to say, in our culture today, our hyper sexualized culture, I'm not sure any of us are unscathed by sexual damage. I think we have all been introduced to things, whether it's something we saw in a movie, in a magazine, standing in the checkout line, something that was done to us as a child or a young person. I think we probably all have some form of damage to our sexual selves, and we need to have compassion for that, and we need to recognize that we are all struggling for health in this area.
That's a really good point. I think the generation that's coming up, especially, but even, our age, we have been exposed, to the sexual revolution, to unhealthy sexuality. And,
Mhm.
everywhere we go, basically out there in society, we're being reinforced with negative ideas about sexuality. And we all do have some damage. You typically, society has put some guidelines on how to behave appropriately, and unfortunately we're not doing that anymore, and I feel really bad for younger and younger children who are maybe experimenting with putting on their, their mother's panties or putting on their sister's nylons. Typically, that, a child like that would be told, you know what, that's your sister's, that's your mother's, that's not yours, you need to wear your clothes. Now they might go to school and be celebrated. And so we have teachers who are encouraging this paraphilia, and it's going to develop into a very unhealthy sexuality for these young men.